The Great Pyramids are full of fascinating secrets. Even the location of the Great Pyramid is remarkable. Did you know that if you type in the scaled value of the speed of light in meters per second as the value for the latitude into Google Earth, you land exactly on top of the Great Pyramid? Now of course you will say, wait a minute, we're talking meters and seconds. There's no way this could be anything other than coincidence. And yes, this would indeed be the logical initial response, and in fact, this is where most people will abandon the conversation and disregard anything that ties the meter to ancient Egypt as coincidence immediately. But I'm going to dig a little deeper than that to see if that truly is the end of the story. I want to make clear that sure, it could all just be a coincidence. I personally do not believe that this is the case, but I'll leave it up to you after watching this video. Okay, to tackle this topic, first we have to look at the units in question on which everything hinges upon: the meter and the second. If we cannot establish a connection between these units and the ancient Egyptians, we will have to call it all a coincidence. But let's get right into it and start with the meter. There are two possibilities that the meter could be connected to the ancient Egyptians and their metrology. First, the meter and ancient Egyptian units of measurement both have a common object of reference on which they are based: the Earth. Second, the meter is the result of a discrete transmission of metrological units or knowledge over time. If we want to understand the mysterious historical connections, it is also necessary to understand the context of the imperial system of measurement, which has been preserved in discrete channels of transmission on behalf of societies such as the Freemasons and the academies of sciences in Europe, who later defined the meter. In this video I will provide you with some fascinating historical connections, but first I will start with the geodetic logic of the meter, in other words, hypothesis 1. The meter and ancient Egyptian units of measurement both have a common object of reference on which they are based, which is Earth measurements. So what is the meter and why was it designed in the first place? Like mentioned before, the meter was introduced on behalf of the French Academy of Sciences at the end of the 18th century. The newly developing scientific tradition was looking for ways to elevate the degree of standardization in the world by establishing a set of scientific units of measurements. So in order to design the meter, they chose to measure a meridian and to come up with a unit resulting from the subdivision of this measurement. The idea was to have a cosmic distance or length, so to speak, in this case the circumference of the Earth, as a point of reference for a standardized unit of measurement. And so the meter was introduced as 1/10,000,000th of a meridian of the planet going from the equator through Paris to the North Pole. However, the measurement of Earth's circumference on behalf of the French Academy of Sciences wasn't perfect. There was a small error in the measurement of the meridian. Or was there? Jean-Baptiste Joseph Delorme and Pierre-François-André Méchain, the two main men commissioned to measure the Earth and come up with a meter on behalf of the French Academy of Sciences, conducted very accurate surveys as part of the work to define the length of the meter. They were appointed by the French Academy of Sciences in 1792 to lead the commission responsible for determining the length of the quadrant of the meridian, in other words, the arc of the Earth's surface between the equator and the North Pole. They used a combination of astronomical observations, including measuring the position of the stars and the sun, and trigonometry to determine the length of the quadrant of the meridian. And they divided this task of measuring the meridian into two parts. One team, led by Delorme, measured the northern section, and the other team, led by Méchain, measured the southern section. So the two teams met in the middle of their survey at the location of an ancient Roman milestone that had been used by previous surveyors. They compared the measurements from their two sections and found that they agreed to within a few millimeters. And so the final value for the meter was pretty accurate, with an uncertainty of less than 0.2 millimeters. In other words, the error of the meter is 0.0002. But now, let's take our journey back to ancient Egypt for a moment, and to the most famous construction in the world, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Why, you might ask? It's because from surveying the Great Pyramid, our modern civilization was able to determine the unit of measurement that was used in the construction of the Great Pyramid: the Royal Egyptian cubit. Based on the surveys of pioneers such as Flinders Petrie, it became evident that the Great Pyramid's original dimensions used to be 280 times 440 Royal Egyptian cubits. From the casing stones of the Great Pyramid, it also became evident that the original height, without the pyramid's 1-cubit platform, was 146.6 to 146.7 meters. This, in combination with more detailed studies of cubit rods that were found throughout Egypt, made it possible to determine and pinpoint the correct value for the Royal Egyptian cubit quite precisely, at least as it was used for the Great Pyramid, as 0.5236 meters. both the measurement of the Great Pyramid as 146.6 or 0.7 meters in original height without its socle, as well as the precise value of the Royal Egyptian cubit as 0.5236 or 0.524 meters, is the result of meticulous surveying work over centuries, and these values are decisive with only a small margin of error. I will add some sources for you in the description of this video, in case you would like to double check this. But you don't even have to trust the sources. You can simply calculate it for yourself by just taking the height or width of the Great Pyramid in meters and divide it by the height or width of the Great Pyramid in Royal Egyptian cubits, which is 280 or 440, to find precisely the length of one Royal Egyptian cubit as it was used in the Great Pyramid. Now this number 0.5236 may seem inconspicuous to you, but it reveals some very interesting geometrical relationships. Imagine we have a circle with radius 1. If we divide the circle into 6 equal pieces, for example, simply by drawing in a seed of life, which is one of the most fundamental operations in sacred geometry, by the way, we will find that each of these 6 pieces will be 0.5236 units in length. This is pi divided by 6, if we use 1 as the radius of the circle. If we use 1 as the diameter, 0.5236 will correspond to 1/12 of the circle. If we now make a sphere out of this diameter 1 circle, the sphere's volume would also be pi divided by 6 cubed units, just cubit. So we now understand that pi divided by 6 is a very interesting ratio, which stands for one of the most profound geometrical relationships. And it happens to be exactly the relationship between meter and Royal Egyptian cubit. Oh, and one more thing. The Royal Egyptian cubit is, as we know, 0.5236 meters, or roughly pi over 6 meters. Now, there was another unit which was used a lot in ancient Egypt, and it is called the short cubit, which is about 44.8 to 45 centimeters, according to most sources. Now, check out the value of pi divided by 7. Coincidentally, it appears to be the same value as the short cubit. So, if there is this geometrical link between the meter and the Royal Egyptian cubit, and it is not just coincidence, we might ask, does the meter appear in other places at the pyramid or in ancient Egypt? To put it short, yes it does. In the 1980s, a pyramidion was discovered near the Red Pyramid of Dashur. Its dimensions were exactly 100 centimeters times 157 centimeters. In other words, 1 meter times pi divided by 2 meters. It also happened to have the same format as the Great Pyramid of Giza, in terms of its height to width ratio. And we find another strong indication for the meter having been used in ancient Egypt, if we take a closer look at the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid. First of all, the overall perimeter of the King's Chamber happens to be 31.4 meters, in other words, pi times 10 meters. And there are some more very interesting relationships between the meter and the Royal Egyptian cubit that are reflected in the design of the Great Pyramid, but that is a topic for one of my next videos. But how can this be? Did the ancient Egyptians use the meter as we know it? At first glance, this seems like an absurd proposition, but let's take a closer look at this idea before we discard it immediately into the dustbin of coincidence or pseudoscience. First of all, the Royal Egyptian cubit is obviously related to the human body. While the initial assumption of most people is that this is only a random length taken from some pharaoh, we need to first understand the ancient Egyptian concept of the anthropocosm, which is a name for the ancient Egyptian science of embedding the human into a grand cosmic context. Explained in most detail by legendary Egyptologist Schwaller de Lubitz, to put this short, an integral part of ancient Egyptian cosmology was to establish a connection between the human, earth, and the cosmos, as part of a grand system of cosmic order. I would highly recommend looking into Schwaller de Lubitz's Temple of Man for anyone who's interested in the topic for a more detailed and complicated overview of this facet of the rich esoteric world of the ancient Egyptians. For now, let's just keep this logic in mind of creating resonance between the human body and the cosmos through means of measurement. After all, the word geometry is literally the measurement of Earth, containing an important reference to the concept of scale invariance. But some of you still may be inclined to put this off as coincidences or looking for numbers. So how can we then interpret these seemingly coincidental connections? Well, In order to make a connection between these two units plausible, like we said in the beginning, one of the two following conditions has to be true. First, the meter was established based on logic that is similar to the Royal Egyptian cubit, meaning, in other words, the Royal Egyptian cubit was also calibrated with regards to the circumference of the Earth. For that being the case, the Egyptians must have known the dimensions of the planet first. The official explanation is that the ancient Egyptians did not know of the dimensions of the planet. But, considering the fact that the Great Pyramid works perfectly well as a 1 to 43,200 scale model of the Northern Hemisphere, even accounting for the oblateness of Earth with the pyramid socle, this aspect clearly requires a more nuanced discussion. I personally am convinced that maybe not the entire culture of the ancient Egyptians, but at least the builders of the pyramid did have this geodetic knowledge at their disposal and incorporated it into the structure of the Great Pyramid. I will make a long video on the Great Pyramid being a scale model of Earth in the context of a coherent system of geometry in the future. But for now you can check out the YouTube shorts on this channel. So all in all, the Great Pyramid, having been built with Royal Egyptian cubits, therefore provides a direct link between the Royal Egyptian cubit and the measurements of the Earth, and therefore also to the meter. So we already have a plausible scenario for condition 1. And now to a completely different discussion with condition number 2, which is, there was a discrete transmission of ancient units that were used also in the conception of the meter. So if you're for some reason still not convinced by the geometrical argument for a link between the meter and the Royal Egyptian cubit, let's take a closer look at the possibility of a transmission of ancient units having taken place that ultimately led to the meter. So now we're talking about the French Academy of Sciences, who was responsible for the conception of the meter. First of all, the French Academy of Sciences had strong links to Freemasonry, members of which certainly played a significant role in the preservation of ancient units of measurements. To just name one example, Benjamin Franklin was a foreign associate of the French Academy of Sciences, and he was an active Freemason for 60 years of his life, and he was also one of the founding fathers of the United States of America. And the origins of the imperial system, meaning feet, inches, miles, and so on, clearly shows that we're dealing with a preservation of ancient units and geometry. Check my video on Stonehenge out for more information on that. Randall Carlson has demonstrated how there are various ancient measurement units that were considered sacred and which fit into a master diagram of proportions arising from the combination of squares and circles, using compass and straightedge. These units belong to a metrological system that was preserved over time, which includes the Royal Egyptian cubit, as you can see here. And they also clearly left a plethora of esoteric, and more specifically ancient Egyptian esoteric symbolism in the genesis of the United States of America. But that is also a topic for another video. However, one of the most prominent foreign associates of the French Academy of Sciences in the 18th century was none other than Sir Isaac Newton. But who was Isaac Newton? You probably know him as perhaps the father of modern science. However, did you know that he viewed himself first and foremost as an alchemist? Not only that, but he also strongly believed that the Great Pyramid held the key to many occult and alchemical secrets of the ancient world. And not just the Great Pyramid, but explicitly its unit of measurement, the Egyptian cubit. The Smithsonian Magazine writes, Newton was interested in the cubit, a unit of measurement used by the Great Pyramid's builders. He believed that it could enable him to figure out the exact dimensions of other ancient structures. Not that IQ is a very reliable indicator, but Newton's IQ is estimated to have been around 190 to 200. And Isaac Newton himself writes in A Dissertation upon the Sacred Cubit of the Jews and the Cubits of the Several Nations, which was republished in 1737, in the middle of the pyramid was a chamber most exquisitely formed of polished marble, containing the monument of the king. The length of this chamber was 34.38 English feet, and the breadth 17.19. That is, it was 20 cubits long and 10 cubits broad. The cubit being supposed to be 1.719 of the English foot. He is clearly talking about the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid here. The difference between this measure and the former is 0.0125, or 1/30th of a foot, that is about 1/7 of an inch, an error of no importance, if we consider the much greater irregularities observed by Mr. Greaves in the best buildings of the Romans. In the middle of this gallery was a way of polished marble, 3.435 feet, that is, 2 cubits broad, and on both sides the way were 2 banks, like benches, of polished marble likewise, 1.717 feet broad and 1.717 feet deep, that is, in breadth and depth 1 cubit. Who will therefore imagine that so many dimensions not at all depending upon each other should correspond by mere chance with the length of the cubit assigned by us? So let me summarize it like this. Isaac Newton concluded 2 values for the Royal Egyptian cubit used in the construction of the Great Pyramid. The 2 values are 1.717 English feet to 1.719 English feet. And now what are those values in meter? For the cubit as found in the Great Pyramid, 0.5233 to 0.5236 meters. So Isaac Newton clearly knew about the length of the Royal Egyptian cubit, which he called the cubit of man. And the International Standard, a scientific magazine from 1884, published on page 358, from independent sources, Sir Isaac Newton recovered this cubit as 1.7117 feet or 20.604 inches. And the 20.604 inch value corresponds to Newton's 0.5233 to 0.5236 meter value. So there we have proof for this value of the Royal Egyptian cubit being known and emphasized by Newton himself, who, as we established, had strong links to the French Academy of Science. And the French Academy of Science was responsible for the design of the meter just a couple of decades later. Another detail, the design of the meter began in 1793, but it was fixated only with a physical platinum iridium bar on the summer solstice of 1799. And 1799 is coincidentally right in the time when Napoleon conducted his expeditions in Egypt to establish a scientific enterprise in the region between 1798 and 1802. And so now we have reasonable scenarios for A, the Royal Egyptian cubit being linked to the measurement of Earth in the truest sense of the word geometry, and B, the discrete transmission of these ancient units through institutions such as the European Academies of Sciences and Freemasonry. So we can establish a link between the Royal Egyptian cubit and the meter. Now, let's talk about the unit seconds. While the unit second was not officially in use in ancient Egyptian times as we know it, the fact that the Great Pyramid is a scale model of the Northern Hemisphere in the scale of 1 to 43,200 and therefore 1 to 86,400 to the polar diameter of Earth, there is a clear indication that the sexagesimal division of space was extended to cycles of time as well. After all, seconds result just from 2 degrees of minuteness. First, dividing the hour into more minute parts, the minutes, and then second degrees of minuteness, to the seconds. And we know for a fact that the sexagesimal and duodecimal division of time went back all the way to Sumer and was then enhanced by the ancient Babylonians. From them, we have the first records of this practice of dividing the circle into finer degrees of minuteness. And ancient Babylon and Egypt were of course in a rich exchange with each other. Keep also in mind that most of this esoteric knowledge in ancient Egypt was forbidden to be written down or shared to a greater public, sometimes even punishable by death. That means that we should be open to the possibility that the abstract concept of a second, in other words, the division of circles into finer parts than degrees based on the sexagesimal system, could in fact have existed already in the pyramid building age. I don't think that this is an unreasonable proposition. And another point that supports this is that if the ancient Egyptians did not have this finer division of the circle, how did they manage to align the Great Pyramid so precisely by less than 0.06 degrees to true north? So there we have another strong indication, if not proof, that the pyramid builders did in fact divide the circle into finer units of minuteness. And the most likely system for that would be the sexagesimal system, based on the division of space and time. There we have the context that enables us to have the discussion about the pyramid being chosen at this peculiar spot, that happens to be on the latitude of the scaled speed of light in meters per seconds. I want to repeat again that I'm not saying that this is necessarily intended on behalf of the pyramid builders, but I do think that this video will open up a more nuanced discussion on the topic. Sure, we can either write it off as all just being a coincidence, or open up the possibility that it is indeed part of a coherent system called Geo-Metry, the measurement of Earth. Now, before I end this video, I would like to anticipate some other questions that are going to come up otherwise. Some of you might say, but the value for the latitudinal coordinate is 29.9792458, so clearly different powers of 10 are involved, and not exactly the speed of light in meters. And yes, that is true. However, keep in mind that changing the powers of 10 is the most common mathematical operation that is used to simplify and standardize numerical values in a society that uses the decimal system, which the ancient Egyptians clearly did. And as you can see, the ancient Egyptians even had hieroglyphs for different powers of 10. And this concept is called scaling. Changing the power of 10 of a number, which is scaling, does not change the underlying character or properties of the number, but only the representation of it in terms of units or magnitude, for a society that uses the decimal system. The value of the number remains the same, but its representation in terms of units or magnitude may change. Let me give you an example. If we fly from Berlin to London, assuming we use the metric system, are we going to say we are flying 1 million meters? Most likely not. We will instead scale the number on the basis of the powers of 10 and say 1000 kilometers instead, to make it more appropriate to the scale. Both 1000 kilometers and 1 million meters express the same distance. They are just scaled to express different orders of magnitude. It is therefore not unreasonable to allow that this logic also applies to 29.979, as, like we saw, the ancient Egyptians were also using a decimal system. Another point that may be brought up is that 29.9792458 is too accurate to determine a line of latitude on the planet. And yes, instead, I would suggest it is more reasonable to say that there is a range of latitudinal coordinates from 29.9782 to 29.982 that all go through the pyramid. So in other words, what this means is that the lowest range of accuracy would be 99.991% to 99.996% for the latitude to go precisely through the Great Pyramid's top or King's Chamber. If we include the whole pyramid, which is I think the more reasonable proposition, the range of accuracy is therefore 99.991 to 100%. And like mentioned earlier, we have to leave room for a marginal error to occur, like in any metrological investigation, due to the slight changes in size of the planet over time, as well as possible errors in the relationship between cubit and meter. Now some of you might ask, but coordinates are based on the Greenwich meridian in London, so isn't it wrong? To that I would respond, please check that you understand the difference between longitude and latitude. Notice how only the latitudinal value is the subject of this video. The reference object for the latitude is the equator. Wouldn't you agree that the equator is a universal object of reference to choose for the design of a geodetic system? Now, of course, the longitude will be arbitrary due to the selection of Greenwich, which is our point of reference, but certainly not the reference point that the ancient Egyptians would have used. So we cannot make qualified comments on that value based on our system, unless we find a way to relate it to the prime meridian that the ancient Egyptians would have used. I personally have my thoughts on this, but I will also discuss this in a separate video. Now, what about plate tectonics? Wouldn't that have changed the location of the Great Pyramid? And let me respond with this question. Do plate tectonics work along a perfectly vertical north-south line? If not, why is the Great Pyramid not out of alignment with the 4 cardinal directions? But I do think that is one of the more interesting questions, and it would be good to research to see how the pyramid is not out of alignment, assuming that there have been significant tectonic movements involved. Another question might be, but there are multiple pyramids in Egypt, why exactly the Great Pyramid? Well, to put it short, because it is the largest and arguably most important pyramid, if not construction, in the world. Oh, and another thing, if we start from the top of the Great Pyramid, its distance to the 30-degree line of latitude in a straight line will correspond exactly to 10 pyramid side lengths. If you want to ask me more questions, please consider joining my Patreon. I'm building a community over there where we can engage in some of these fascinating discussions. Anyhow, thank you for watching this video until the end, and I hope this video encourages a healthy discussion about the Great Pyramid's location and why it may not be just coincidence.